Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to the greatest pod show you have ever heard. What's on your workbench? Yes, indeed, we are back for yet another episode, which is, I believe, 13 or somewhere in that vicinity. I've lost count. But it is the best podcast that you've ever stumbled across in your drunken wanderings across the intraweb. And it is, of course, What's on Your Workbench. My name is Chili, and with me, as always, is my great friend from across the globe, Andrew. Andrew, how you doing today, buddy?
Good. And may the algorithms bless us. So I guess I was really excited. I wanted to follow up first on what happened after our podcast last week. So it's a Friday morning when we normally record podcasts. So Saturday came along and I went to the store and I got myself a whole bunch of oils and greases and derusters, and I went through and I cleaned up a whole bunch of my tools, and it feels great.
Yes.
So it's super weird. Like, there's definitely like a rust issue where I live, but tools that I have hanging up here they're not really too bad. Like, they will eventually get a bit of rust on them, but I have like some metal toolboxes and I have some tools in it, and it's as if between the metal in the toolboxes and the metal in the tools are almost acting like a sacrificial anode, and they are preferentially rusting. So like, I had a bunch of drivers, just little bits of metal, and they were like, you couldn't even recognize what bit they were. They were so covered in rust, and I kind of knew it was there, but I'd kind of just been ignoring the problem. So yeah, I went through and I soaked it all in a de-rusting agent, and then borrowed my wife's ultrasonic cleaner that she normally uses for jewelry, and that does a great job of cleaning up the bits. So yeah, no, I've got a toolbox that's in a lot better shape than it was last time we spoke, and I had some nice chisels in there that had actually had a bit of rust. So I need to go through and spend a bit of time sharpening them and honing them and getting all like that. But I've at least cleaned up the rust, and I actually cleaned up the handles on those as well, and put a bit of linseed oil on them, and just kind of gave them a bit of a light sand because they were pretty rough when I bought them. But yeah, so
brilliant.
Bit of inspiration there went a long way, and it wasn't actually too bad. It was, I think, on Sunday afternoon I ended up just puttering around and soaking and cleaning and then sanding, and it was a bit of good fun. So
nice.
There we go.
Hey, your metal toolboxes, are you talking about like toolboxes with drawers?
Yeah, like Craftsman.
Okay. Do you have a liner in the bottom of those drawers?
I didn't, but I have now.
Okay. What it probably is actually a reaction between dissimilar metals.
Yeah.
Which is not terribly common, with steel on steel. But when you're talking about tool steel, you get a lot of weird alloys sometimes. Yeah. And sometimes those do not play nicely with straight steel when stored for a long time. Yeah, so I bet those liners are probably going to make a huge difference.
Yeah, and once I kind of noticed there was a problem, I did try and get it all off, but I think the damage had already been done at that point. But yeah, it's definitely, I was not expecting it. It's not something I've seen until I moved back to Australia, which was kind of surprising. And it seemed, I've got two Craftsman toolboxes, and it seems to affect one and not the other. So it's like that toolbox metal is something going on. It's just kind of a bit of weird, bit of chemistry going on there. But yeah, so
it's not aluminum, is it?
It might be.
It may be aluminum. In which case, yeah, you're definitely going to get some problems with some dissimilar metal corrosion. You see it a lot in plumbing. Is where you really see it, and also in some electrical, like conduit work, where you have copper pipe going into a steel fitting. There's a specific kind of fitting you have to use there that has basically a piece of plastic between the two dissimilar metals and keeps them from corroding each other.
Yeah, well, it's basically the chemistry behind why bridges don't get rotted away and boats don't get rotted away. They basically, you put a sacrificial anode that, will preferentially erode that rather than the piece of metal that you want. It's just weird that it's my tools. I would have thought I guess if it was aluminium, it would be a bit less preferential than steel. But yeah, lesson learned, and get those liners in. And mind you, I don't try and put too much stuff in those toolboxes. I much prefer having them out, but I do have them, so I do use them. But yeah, so that was my weekend last weekend. That was what was all over my workbench.
Well, that sounds productive.
But yeah, it definitely was productive. But having said that, what is on your workbench this week?
Oh, you're switching it up on me here.
Oh, is it my turn? Is it? I can't remember.
I can go first. I don't care.
All right, let's do it.
So on my workbench is last week we talked a bit about the flower holder, the standing flower box that I was making, and that one had a metal frame clad in cedar, and I've started now working on the sister piece of that, which is all cedar, because it has an open bottom. It's not fully enclosed. It'll be an open shelf underneath. And so the whole thing of this one is cedar, and the frame of that went much, much faster. And it really wasn't terribly interesting.
It looks beautiful though.
Thank you. I just used pretty basic lap joinery to embed my rails and stiles in the 4 post legs. Just nice tight joints that keep things from wiggling around. Nothing too crazy. But what I wanted to really kind of talk about today was the top. So the very top of each of the planters has some cedar forming a kind of cap piece all the way around. And that means cutting mitered 45s.
My nemesis.
Yes, which a lot of people hate. And even if you have like the most high-end chop saw, sliding miter, compound miter saw, even on a lot of table saws, you'll get some inconsistencies in your miters. Now, the reason for inconsistencies in a chop saw is that you don't have a stationary blade like you do in a table saw. That arbor is, firmly cemented in place. That blade's not moving for the most part. Now, in a chop saw, though, you have a joint, at the back, and that joint's going to have a little bit of play in it. Furthermore, a lot of chop saw blades have some reliefs in them which cut down vibration, but it does allow for a little bit more flex in the blade. So you'll have a generally straight 45, but there'll be some kind of lumps and dips in it. And that can be a huge problem when you're trying to get something to fit together nicely.
No gaps.
And especially if you're cutting a 45 by hand, like I do a lot of times, you're going to have some inconsistencies. So that's when we bring in a really cool little piece called a shooting board. So if you're watching, you can see this is an example of my shooting board here. I've got a place for a wedge right here that makes a perfect 90 degree. And then this wedge in here is set at a 45 degree. So basically what you do is you take your piece and you lay it against this fence, which provides a backer to your piece so that you don't have chip out. And your plane rides down here in this trough and allows you to take out any of those inconsistencies and come up with a really precise 45 degree angle. And of course, you could do this for any angle. Like if you're working on an octagonal piece, you can make another shooting board for that that's set at the correct angle. And I really doubt you're going to be able to see this very well. So this one I haven't touched yet, and it's pretty consistent in how it looks on camera. But if you look at this one, maybe if I can find the golden angle
contrast
here. Son of a gun. I can't really get
oh,
there we go.
There we go.
But if you look at this one in real life, there's some really shiny spots on it. And that's the part that the plane has hit already. And I'll actually run the plane on this until the whole thing is that smooth, shiny, kind of consistent feel. Because that means that I have a perfect 45 the entire length of this 45-degree miter. It's a really, really, really simple piece. It's got, a cleat on the bottom side of it so that I can just set it right up against my bench. If I really want to get a good hold on it, I can put it on the face vise in my bench and hold it, really steady. And then it just has, very simple workings to get a really nice, clean, either 45 or a perfect 90-degree, which is a pain to do on end grain, especially. I mean, that gets, it's so easy to chip stuff out and to end up ruining your cut instead of making it better. And this is a very, very simple way to do that pretty easily.
Oh man, you're speaking my language. This is, as somebody who's spent a lot of time messing around with picture frames to make them bigger and smaller, and it's an absolute nightmare, and it's a problem that pretty well I've just at this point given up on and just gone, I'll just get it close enough and kind of move on and won't lose too much sleep over it. But that makes that makes a lot of sense, just using a plane to finish it off. How do you get the right length then? Do you cut it proud and then plane it down to a marking? Is that?
Yep. So especially with things like picture frames, where you need to have pretty exact lengths, then what you do is you cut your piece proud of your total length. And I'll make a marking with a marking knife.
Yep.
on my piece, because that is one, it's incredibly precise to use a marking knife. Two, what it does, a marking knife will cut the fibers, the top fibers of the wood, and leave you with a really, really beautifully square shoulder once you plane down to it. So yeah, you cut both sides proud of your marking knife mark, and then you just whip it in the shooting board and shave it down till you hit your mark.
And what kind of plane are you using for that?
So I use they make really, really fancy planes.
Yeah.
That have,
I will never use,
that are specifically for this. They're shooting board planes, and they have a big sole and also a really large secondary sole at a 90-degree angle. And then the handle on them is actually like at a 45, so that you can push into the corner, of your shooting board. But I just use a block plane like this, small block plane. The important thing is that this one is a low angle block plane, which when you think low angle, you're thinking, okay, it's going to give me it's going to be easier to push through wood because it's a lower angle, less resistance. But it's actually the opposite. And the reason for that is that most planes, when you put them together, the iron goes in with the bevel down. Well, in a low angle block plane, the bevel goes up. So you actually end up with a much steeper cutting edge than you do on a normal plane. And you want that because you're taking very, very fine amounts, and you want to get a very precise, smooth surface. A lower angled iron will have a tendency, it's going to want to dive. It's going to want to follow the grain more, whereas the steeper that cutting surface is, the more it wants to just glide across.
Yeah, it's almost like you're shaving, kind of trying to shave the top of it off.
Yeah, that's why your final process, like after you run a plane in a lot of like fine furniture making, your final process is using a card scraper, which is just a hardened piece of thin steel that you put a burr on at a 90-degree angle, and you run it at a very steep angle, and it takes these really tiny fine shavings to smooth everything out and create a really nice surface. But that's, a super, super steep angle that you're running that at.
Mm. And how, I guess, how did you make the shooting board then? It looks pretty basic, but.
It really is. I have a very basic setup on mine. I've got a piece of poplar backing board here. And then another piece of poplar on it to create this, this little trough for my plane. And then within that, to make these cutouts for my wedges, I just used like a sliding bevel, and a T-square, just, pretty basic carpentry tools to get those laid out. You cut down to the depth you want, which is obviously not as deep as your block you're putting in, because you want to have that fence there.
Yep.
And then I just chiseled out the bottom.
Yeah.
To make it flat. Ideally, I would do that. If I were to remake another one now, what I would do is I would use my old school router plane, which works just like a router, except it's manual. You set a depth with this blade, and just clear everything out. Yes, there you go. One of the greatest tools ever. I love my router plane. Yep. So I mean, it's pretty darn simple. I've got I had to do some pieces that were a bit larger, a bit thicker, for another project, but I was smoothing out the 90-degree ends. And my fence that I had wasn't large enough. So I just took another piece and added onto it to give it more thickness. And then I made this proud, the new piece I added on, I made it proud of the original and planed down to the original. And that's, the only downside of this is it is somewhat sacrificial. The end of this will wear down with time. And you will have to kind of remake your little fence pieces, and eventually you'll have to remake the shooting board too, because you're pounding this in. It's a wedge, and so you're pounding it in to get it flush, and so you're constantly compressing those fibers in the board, and over time it's just going to get to the point where it's not as accurate and it's a little worn out, and you got to make another one. But it's well worth it. For the headache it saves you on miters.
Yeah, no, that's like I said, I've messed around with doing like picture frames and stuff, and now pretty well my rule is just avoid it if I can. If I can somehow design out the problem, I'm all for that, because I mean I'm just using a pretty basic miter box, and it's it's just a mess. But I feel like that shooting board is well within my grasp, and I think I've got a plane that I could probably try, or that might be worth an actual proper purchase, because it is when I want to do it, it is I want to be able to do it right, and that's actually a path that I think I could pull off. But that's super interesting.
Paul Sellers has a really great tutorial on YouTube for how to make a shooting board, and of course there's others as well. But I really like Paul's approach, and he's a very old school woodworker, and I mean he does projects entirely with hand tools. There are some other folks who are, sufficiently younger than Paul, who also have some really great informational, channels on YouTube. And they do a lot of hand tool work. But then you'll see like they're like me, where they'll cheat with some things and use, I'll use a power drill.
Yeah.
I'm not too proud for that. Um, but Paul's super old school and he does everything by hand.
Yep. Oh. Yeah. You mean you don't have these rolling around your shop all the time?
Yeah, I got my brace and bit set.
If it's a competition.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I really love, there's some things like especially larger, when I'm drilling larger diameter holes for dowels, like when I did the bench recently, and I did the dowel, the through dowel joinery where the arms go through the back piece. I prefer to use this for that, because I have some awesome old auger bits, which you saw in the maintenance episode we talked about. That was one of the auger bits for this brace and bit set. And they just work so amazingly well. A big part of it is the fact that they've got that snail at the very tip of the bit, which is the little threaded part. And so you can drill through until that comes through the opposite side. And then you can back out and put that snail in the hole that came through, and go back from the other side to have your holes perfectly lined up and a beautifully smooth hole all the way through.
Yeah.
And this one happened to be a good friend of mine who is, he's in his mid-70s now. I got this from him. It was his grandfather's, who was a shipwright.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, I just, like most things with hand tools, it slows you down. And I find if you're slower, you make less mistakes and speeds up the whole process. So
yeah,
that's usually when I'm grabbing for those, is when I want to be precise, and I know that I'm not going to rush it. If I'm going to do it by hand, this is going to take forever. I better try and actually do it right, rather than doing it 5 times. But no,
yeah, I find that hand tools, one, you make less mistakes because more is at stake as you're doing it. 2, learning how to do things really well with hand tools also improves how you work with power tools. Yep. Because you learn a lot more about setup and how to go through things in a logical process. And it really does help your work with power tools as well, and your precision there. Ultimately, I mean, one of my goals ultimately is to get to the point where, someone like Paul Sellers, he will build a piece with hand tools in the same amount of time that it takes most people to build with power tools. When you get your skills to that level, that you're not constantly fixing, little mistakes, which aren't really mistakes, they're just inaccuracies. It's incredible how quickly you can build with hand tools.
Yeah, it's definitely, so I mean, it's learning that setup, which is why I kind of purposely started off my making again journey kind of with hand tools, and then now I'm with hand power tools, and then eventually I'll hopefully be down to benchtop tools. But I've definitely learned a lot by, when you're doing the hand tools, it's like it takes a lot more time initially, and you've got to really understand those tools, understand those methods. And then not only do you appreciate those power tools, if you've managed to hurt yourself with a hand tool, you understand that when you go to the power tool, there's a lot more at stake. Like when I'm working with this, I can take a nice gouge out of my hand, but when I'm working with a circular saw, you won't even know it until it's done. It'll be over. And so, I've definitely, I would personally recommend that to anybody, is if you can, start with at least some hand tools. Obviously, it's all going to be different depending on the project, but it's definitely and the thing I love about it is it's quiet. I used to work in the field, in the oil field, and it was constant for 14-20 hour shifts. And when I'm in the workshop and I just have some music playing and you just got that gentle scrape of wood, oh man, it's much, I much prefer that to, I mean, it's the circular saw, you kind of get in the groove and just start cutting, but yeah, it's that quiet I really enjoy.
I hate earplugs and earmuffs, and so I really try to minimize the amount of time I have to spend wearing those, because I'd rather have music or a podcast or something playing while I'm working, or doing. I don't personally really enjoy this. It drives me nuts, but there's a whole lot of people who are into this whole ASMR fad. And I actually did a piece for church while we were in lockdown for pandemic. We had these different things, different videos we were putting together through the week. And one of them was Meditation Mondays. And so I did a Meditation Monday piece. The background to is all sounds from my workshop. So it's the sound of hand sawing and hand planing and hand drilling. Like that's the kind of ASMR background, in this piece, which turned out pretty cool. I was pleased with that. I can handle that kind. It's just like when people are like ASMR of like people chewing. That's like that is my trigger.
Yeah, it doesn't do much for me. My brain's a little bit too active. I don't want to relax. I'm kind of the one where I'm like, well, while I'm listening to one podcast, it'd be awesome if I could listen to another podcast so I could learn twice as much. And it's like, no, that doesn't work. But that's how my brain is.
Run an earbud off of your computer and then one off your phone.
and not listen to anything or learn anything is usually what happens. But yeah, no, I mean, sometimes what was I doing the other night? I was doing some leather work, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And I was going to put some music on, and I ended up just kind of listening to the tools as I was going, and just kind of that peace. It's definitely sometimes enjoyable. So
yeah. Well, I'm sorry I didn't have anything like super enthralling working on this week. But
that was awesome.
I want to hear about some leather work. So what's on your workbench?
Well, what's on my workbench is a ton of leather and leather associated tools. So as we have mentioned previously, we have a medieval festival coming up. And what good medieval peasant would there be if he didn't have shoes? So that is what I've actually been working on this week. So let me show you. They're not finished yet, but I have a couple pairs of, I believe they're called turnshoes. But basically they're medieval.
Hold on. Did you say turd shoes, like TURD?
No, TURN, turn shoes. Oh. But I can see the confusion. For those of you that cannot see the picture, they're brown and they kind of look like big turds. Mind you, that would hurt coming out. But anyway, I digress. But yeah, so there's this, that if you go to any website or costume store and look up medieval shoes, pretty well everybody goes to boots. That's what everybody likes. That's the sexy thing. And from my understanding, boots really don't come around until Renaissance period or later, or they were kind of like a specialty for riding. Like the classic cowboy boot with the big heel, that's almost 100% for being in a stirrup, and for keeping you in that stirrup. And so for most of history, you just had basic leather soles. you know, during the ancient and even in the Middle Ages, they would put metal studs through it, and that would be how you got your grip on grass. There'd be, and you would lose all your grip on pavers or cement or anything. But from what I can understand, it's not a hugely popular topic, making medieval shoes. There are definitely, like, you know, definitely lots of sources out there, but not as much as other things. But yeah, and so I wanted to make some authentic shoes, so I decided to throw these together this week, and they are the weirdest things to wear in the world. I haven't got the laces ready to be able to put them on, but it's like wearing a leather sock. It's so weird. I mean, obviously I haven't really broken them in or got used to wearing them or anything, but yeah, so this is what I have made, and that has been quite a journey. So I couldn't really find any direct patterns on the internet. I'm sure they're out there. I didn't really do an exhaustive search, but I did find a couple YouTube videos. And so I ended up making my own pattern. And so the way I did that, and this is a classic prop making technique or patterning technique in general, where you coat your foot in something like cling wrap or glider wrap or like a thin plastic wrap. And then you either put tape on it, or I used actual alfoil. And what that allows you to do is to basically mold that over your foot. And then once you've molded that over your foot, you can then draw the pattern. And what that allows you to do is when you cut that off, you can lay it flat. So if you were trying to do that with something like paper, it would obviously be really crinkly. And as you folded it out, you know, it would basically unbunch. And while something like a plastic or a tape, like duct tape's really popular for people to use. I used alfoil, aluminum foil, aluminium foil, whatever you want to call it. And then you draw on it whatever you want, like where you kind of want the opening to be, and then you can cut it, and then you lay it flat, and then you convert it to paper. So then I laid it out on paper. But because with this kind of operation, you're turning it inside out. That's basically the fundamental thing when making these turn shoes, is you've got to be able to turn them inside out. So sizing, I was really concerned about sizing. I didn't have a huge amount of leather. Like this is all the leather I had left for the sole. So I could have maybe done it again. I had enough to do over once. And then this is how much I had left over for like the top of the shoe. So pretty well I had enough to do one extra. So I really didn't have a lot of room to play with. So I was really concerned. So then what I did is I actually did another step, is I actually made it out of foam. So this is a thin EVA foam. I believe it's 3 mil, 4 mil, 2 mil, something like that. Because this will behave very similar to leather. You know, it's quite common for prop makers or costume makers, cosplay, to make this kind of foam look like leather, and use leather paints and leather glues, and it's very similar. So once I had that mock-up, I then transferred it to leather, and then I made it out of the leather. I made it once, and then I realized it was too big, and so I had to actually pull it apart, and I remade it. Because the first time I made it, I actually had it around the wrong way. So to see this opening, that's on the inside of your leg. When I first made it, I actually had it on the outside, and I was kind of kicking myself because I was like, oh, I don't want to have to redo this and unthread all of this. But I ended up doing it, and I was glad I did, because I could make it a little bit smaller and a little bit tighter fit. But the way you make it is you actually take your sole and you make your markings for where you're going to put your threads, but you put it through on an angle, so you don't actually go all the way directly through the leather. You go in one side at the top, and then you come out the side of the leather. And the whole reasoning for that is that if you can see the way it sits, so there are no joins on the bottom. And so that way, when you're walking along, as you wear away at your thing, you're not wearing away the thread. So if you had done it like you would normally think of doing it, you'd just sew it straight through. You would have all these exposed threads on the bottom. And then that would obviously be the first thing to wear, and then your shoe would fall apart. So that was the first time I've ever actually tried to do that. And what I was using is bear with me for a sec. So I had a whole bunch of punches. And I'll talk about these in a sec, but basically they come in a variety. So you've got like, I think that's a 6, a 4, a 2, and a 1 punch. And so when I was doing the top parts of my leather, which I was using, I believe, an 8-ounce leather. So not too, it's kind of like a tooling leather for like if you were making a Leatherman case or a sheath or something like that. So it's that kind of thickness. And I'd use these to punch holes all the way through. And then for my, I think it's a 12-ounce leather, for which I was using for the sole, I would basically use this as a marker, and then I'd just use an awl to punch through. And then I just threaded it through. I used like a fake cat's gut thread. I should have used a linen thread kind of thing, but that's what I had, and I know it'll be strong enough, so I decided to just go with that. But yeah, and then you put it all together, and you put it all together inside out. And so then you have to wet it to be able to actually turn it, because it's so stiff. Like, you can look at it, it's almost impossible. So it was actually quite funny, because I was about to have a shower, and so me and my wife went up to go have a shower, and I was like, oh well, I've got to turn this thing inside out, so I'm not going to use water from that thing. So I actually was in the shower, I'll tell you something, if you put one of these things on in the shower, very slippery. It's ridiculous. And apparently you look ridiculous, because my wife, who's had some intestinal pain, had to leave the shower because or the bathroom, because she was in so much pain from laughing at me wearing this thing in the shower. It's a crazy world we live in. I don't know why somebody would laugh at that. But yeah, and then I've been waiting for it to dry for the last day or two, so now it's nice and hard, and gave it some nice leather dye. I need to go back in, it's a bit patchy, but yeah, I'll go in with some kind of waterproofing agent or oil, like a leather oil or a polish or something, just to kind of give it a nice finish. I need to just add some holes, and so I can tighten it up. But yeah, so that's what I've been working on for the last week. So it's been a bit of fun, bit of learning, but I'm quite happy with them overall.
So just to be clear for everybody listening, this is not a competition, but Andrew won this week. I used a shooting board. Andrew became a freaking cobbler. That's crazy.
Well,
wow.
I wouldn't call myself a cobbler, but it's definitely a good prototype. You made
shoes. You're a cobbler. That's awesome. That is so cool. Like, yeah. I'm still just trying to wrap my head around trying to punch holes in that sole in the top and out the side. Like, that is bananas.
Yeah, that was when I first read that. I was like, it's impossible. How thick is that sole to be able to do that? And it's not that difficult. Huh. It's really not that, like, basically what I did is I would just by hand. So normally with like a punch like this, you want to pound on it. And again, I'm probably using the wrong tool, but I just use a wooden mallet. And you punch all the way through. And I wanted to make sure I had the same sizing. So I used the same tool, but I just used my hand pressure to kind of just mark that. And then I just had unfortunately I don't have it with me. I had an awl, and I just basically lined it up almost like using a chisel. So I basically just tried to keep a consistent angle, and I went along and just pushed it through. And there was about, out of all of those holes, there was about 3 that I blew out, and I had to kind of come in at a slightly different angle and kind of manipulate it. But once you kind of got in the body position and you pushed yourself along, it actually was a lot easier than I was expecting.
Hmm.
Yeah, it was, and yeah, I mean, I probably had a night. The leather I was using was nice and thick. It was some leftover from either a suitcase I made or a gladiator armor that I made because things. But yeah, and here I've got a scrap piece here. Yeah, so like, because what you want is you want basically an even hole coming out the side.
Yeah.
And I was expecting that once I started pulling on that thread, that it would actually pull through. Because you're not talking about a huge amount, but because of the way leather is, I kind of in my mind I treat it as like a plywood or whatever. Like you've got very thin layers, but that's not quite how it is. Like there are layers, but the layers don't want to pull apart. They're still quite strongly held together. Because when you're turning it inside out, it's a like you're putting a lot of force on those joins and those holes, and obviously having a lot of holes, helps that disperse that force. But yeah, no, it was a fascinating process, and I was so paranoid that it would not fit right, and so because you wet the leather, it's going to have a bit of shape and a bit of shrinkage and movement, until really today or yesterday when I put them on, I really didn't know if they were going to fit or not. And so when I was doing all my prototyping, what I ended up doing was just kind of accepting that the first one I make, I'm going to probably be off, and not get too hung up on it, and basically just go. And if I was going to err on the side of being too big, and that's what I ended up doing. So I pretty well made one, turned it inside out, realized I had the opening on the wrong side, realized I had, the sole was too big, realized I had a little bit too much room in my foot box. And I basically went back in and cut that, redesigned it, and then put it back together. And once you kind of got in the groove, it really only took about an hour to punch all the holes and sew it together. You kind of get in the groove. And I just did a simple running stitch. I was going to do kind of like a double running stitch, but I ended up it wasn't needed for this project because I had so many holes. And when you look, a lot of people do these that are more historical and they're using the linen thread, they actually have a lot less stitches per inch or whatever, frequency of stitch. But yeah, so that's
So were you using, I'm assuming that's just cow leather?
yes, yep. So I can't remember what piece the base was, because like I said, I've had that kind of floating around for 3 or 4 years. But yeah, the top part I'm pretty sure is a nice shoulder piece, like a 7-8 ounce leather that I picked up a few months ago. It's leather is one of those things I love to have around the workshop. It's a great finishing piece for like making little handles or making little straps or doing things like that. So I feel almost naked not having any leather around the shop, because it's great to have. And as good as those like bags of scrap leather are, there's nothing better than having a couple rolls of veggie tanned leather floating around with a couple different ounces.
Yeah.
But yeah, and then also,
so I know that especially in certain areas of Europe, around medieval time, Renaissance, particularly France and England, well, a lot of what peasants used was pig or swine leather, because that's what was more readily available to their class. Have you used swine leather at all?
I have not. Generally, I've pretty well just been using cowhide. From my understanding, pig leather is softer. It can be quite soft. So, yeah, I imagine you would get a different result. And I mean, that's kind of what I've learned.
It depends on
research.
It depends a lot on. So our modern swine that we have, bred for pork and for it is much different, obviously, but what they would have had back then would have been much more akin to wild boar.
Yeah.
And I know that their hides can be incredibly thick around the ridgeback.
Yeah.
I wonder if that's what was commonly used for sole material.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, it's nowadays leather is very much like, ooh, leather, kind of like if you're wearing leather, it's quite a nice product. Like if you have a leather couch, that's a very high end. In that period, it was very much a utility. It was the best thing you could have because it just worked and it was there. So to have like leather shoes wasn't a high status. That's just what you use because everything else just didn't last. So it's very interesting, that relationship to leather, how it has changed from a couple hundred years ago to now. How from that it was just very much the thing you used because that was available, and it was around, and using it wasn't necessarily a high status symbol, but if you did use it as a high status symbol, there was the workmanship that went into it. And that's one thing I did want to mention is, for my birthday, my parents gave me some money and I was like, oh, I don't know what to spend that on. Usually I like to get some tools. And what I decided to do was I actually went on Amazon and I just picked up a $50 box of basic leatherworking tools. So previously I've done quite a bit of I've done a bit of leather work, making some, I made a gladiator armor piece. I made a leather suitcase. I've made some knife sheaths and things like that. And I've only really had some real basic tools. And what I decided was, I was like, well, I do want to get some, if you watch a lot of leather working videos, there's quite a lot of tools that are just basic tools, like a basic punch set, very useful. So previously I just had one punch. And so for like $50, you can pick up these kits, and none of these tools are high-end tools, but they give you those basic tools. And just having those additional tools made this project a lot easier. So if anybody's interested in doing leather work, that's what I would recommend starting with, that, rather than trying to figure out, do I need a single punch or do I need a quad punch or whatever. If you grab one of those sets, it's going to have all the basic tools you need. And if you wear out one of those tools, then that would be the tool I would go and buy a high-end, or more expensive product of. And I kind of regret not doing that earlier. So that would be, just a little piece of advice that I've learned, is just having that toolbox available with all of those different tools, that some of them I'm like, I don't even know what this is used for. And then it's like, oh, that's what that's used for. Oh, that makes life a lot easier. Kind of thing. So, but yeah, it's been quite fun. I love working with leather. It's just one of the weirdest things, how you can mold it when it's wet, but then you can sew it like fabric, but then you glue it kind of like wood, and I can't wait to finish these off. I think they'll turn out quite well.
That's super cool. I do love leather work too. I think it's immensely interesting. Just out of curiosity, you talked about oiling them. Just out of curiosity, do you know what was traditionally used to treat leather products like that, especially gloves and shoes?
Not, I mean, I think it depends on the period. Like mink oil was pretty common more recently, but I think it was just normally like lard or just a generic fat or oil, if I remember correctly.
It is a very fatty, oily part of the animal, but it's usually the brain.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Brains are fantastic for weatherproofing, and they also make leather very supple.
Yeah, it can be used as part of the tanning process, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, it often was used in the tanning as well. Correct.
Yeah, there's some more. I mean, that was definitely not used on the industrial level, but more on the, especially in the US. My understanding is it was used a lot, like especially in traditional methods of tanning, the brain tanning method. But I don't really know much about it, to be honest.
Yeah, a lot of trappers learned that from native tribes, who, were, obviously phenomenal at using every single bit of an animal. Nothing went to waste. That was incredibly important to them, and still is to this day. But yeah, that's one of the best uses for brains.
Yep. So, but yeah, that is what's been on my workbench this week. Any teasers for what you'll be working on next week, Chili? Or are you still going to be doing some potting bench cedar work? It's coming along beautiful. I must admit, I am enjoying looking at that nice classic woodwork.
I think that I think we'll probably talk about some finish work on these, because I'll be delivering them next week at some point. And so I don't know if I'll be delved too deeply into my next project or not by that point. But yeah, we'll probably talk about some fit and finish work, including imperfections before finishing.
How to hide your crimes.
Yeah. So how about you? What do you got coming up next week?
I think it's going to be more medieval stuff. We're about 3 weeks out, so all focus is going to be pivoting towards that. I have a feeling, unless something breaks around the house or some child has a project due or something. But I think we're mostly clear on that this year. Yeah, because they're about to go on short break for the winter holidays for us. But yeah, so I think it's coming to crunch time. I think we might be trying to make a full medieval dress on the weekend, but we'll see.
Just whip out a dress on a weekend. Yeah, no big deal.
Yeah. Ignorance is bliss. How hard could it be if you don't know how hard it is? No,
awesome. Well, if people are hankering for more of your antics, how can they find you in the meantime?
So I can be found at craftybeetroot.com. I can also be found on YouTube. So if you search Crafty Beetroot, you will find a lot of my crazy videos. And as always, my videos are less tutorials and more of a description of, if I can do it, you can more than likely have a shot at it. And how about you, Chili? How can people find more about you?
You can find me as well on YouTube, Orwood Solutions, on Instagram, Orwood CS, or Facebook, Orwood Solutions, and of course my website, orwoodsolutions.com. If you want to hear more about this podcast or catch more of these fantastic episodes, which are guaranteed to knock your socks off, please find us on your favorite podcasting platform, whether it be Podbean, iTunes, Spotify, some other really hip thing that I've yet to hear about because I'm old and out of touch. We are What's on Your Workbench on all of those podcast platforms. And so we look forward to
yes,
and sharing a little bit more about what's on our workbench.
Thank you.